My name is Daniel Hartwell. I'm in my mid-30s now, and for most of my adult life I've worked inside organizations that value performance on paper more than integrity in practice. I've been a project manager, a strategist, the person who stays late without announcing it, and leaves early without applause. If you asked the people around me back then how they'd describe me, most would say dependable, quiet, non-threatening. The kind of professional you trust with work, but not necessarily with power. I've always known how I'm perceived. I don't dominate rooms. I don't interrupt. I don't raise my voice to be heard. I tend to listen longer than people expect, and I rarely correct someone in public, even when I know they're wrong. For some, that reads as humility. For others, it reads as an absence. And for a few, it becomes an invitation. This story isn't about revenge. It's not about a dramatic takedown or a villain exposed under fluorescent lights. It's about something quieter, and, I think, more familiar to many people than they'd like to admit. It's about what happens when someone smiles at you every morning, praises you behind closed doors, and then slowly rearranges the conditions around you so that failure looks like your fault. When I first joined the company, my boss was supportive in all the ways that mattered privately. Encouraging words in one-on-one meetings. I trust you. You're solid. You've got a future here. In public, that support never quite materialized, but I told myself that was just their style. Not everyone leads out loud. What I didn't realize, what I couldn't see yet, was how silence can be used two ways. How encouragement without witnesses can coexist with sabotage without fingerprints. How a smile can be the last thing you see before the ground shifts slightly under your feet. The emotional journey of this story isn't explosive. It's gradual. It moves through confusion, self-doubt, rationalization, and eventually clarity. There's no moment where I slam my hands on a desk or storm out of a meeting. There's a moment where I stop explaining myself. A moment where I stop trying to be understood by people who benefit from misunderstanding me. I'm telling this now because distance has a way of sharpening truth. I can look back without bitterness, without needing anyone to lose for me to feel whole. What happened changed how I see power, loyalty, and the quiet decisions that define who we become under pressure. If you've ever felt supported in private but undermined in silence, if you've ever wondered whether you were imagining it, this story might sound uncomfortably familiar. Before I go on, let me ask you something gently, without judgment. Have you ever sensed that someone's smile didn't match the position they quietly placed you in? Before anything went wrong, before I had language for what was happening, I occupied a very specific place in that company's ecosystem. I was useful, not visible useful. Not the kind of useful that gets quoted in meetings or name-checked in emails sent to executives. I was the quiet kind, the connective tissue, the person who made other people's ideas land on time, the one who translated chaos into timelines and timelines into deliverables. If something was unclear, it ended up on my desk. If something broke, I fixed it before anyone thought to ask who was responsible. And because of that, people rarely thought about me at all. In meetings, I sat slightly back from the table. Not physically, just energetically. I spoke when asked. I answered clearly. I didn't decorate my points or sell them with confidence theatre. I assumed the work would speak for itself. Sometimes it did. Often it was spoken for by someone else. I noticed early on that my boss never worried about me. Other team members were managed. They were coached loudly, corrected publicly, and praised performatively. I was left alone, trusted, I thought. Respected, I assumed. When deadlines were tight, my name came up in private conversations. When leadership needed reassurance, my boss would say, "Daniel has it." And that was true. I did. I always did. But there was a strange asymmetry to how I existed in that space. If something succeeded, it belonged to the team. If something failed, it drifted, unattached, until it quietly landed near me. No accusation, no confrontation, just a subtle recentering of responsibility. I didn't mind at first. I told myself this was the price of being reliable, that visibility was overrated, that competence didn't need an audience. And to be honest, part of me preferred it this way. I didn't have the appetite for office politics. I didn't enjoy competing for attention. I liked doing things correctly, thoroughly, and without drama. That temperament served me well, until it didn't. My boss smiled at me often. It was an easy smile, familiar, the kind that suggested alignment. In one-on-ones, they'd lean back and say things like, "You're steady. I don't have to worry about you." Or, "You're not like the others. You don't need hand-holding." At the time, I took that as a compliment. What I didn't see was how that perception shaped the role I was assigned without consent. I became the constant, the background assumption, the person whose capacity was treated as infinite because it was never dramatized. I wasn't underestimated in the way movies depict it. No one thought I was stupid. No one mocked me or dismissed me outright. It was subtler than that. I was underestimated in terms of reaction, in terms of boundaries, in terms of how much imbalance I would tolerate without naming it. People assumed I would absorb things, extra work, ambiguous instructions, shifting priorities, credit dilution, responsibility creep. And because I didn't protest, the assumption hardened into expectation. Looking back, I can see how cleanly I fit into the architecture of the place. Every system has load-bearing walls that are never admired because they don't move. They don't announce themselves. They just hold everything up until the pressure becomes too much, or until someone decides to test how much weight they can really take. I wasn't invisible because I lacked value. I was invisible because my value didn't disrupt anything. And that, I would later understand, made me very easy to use. At this stage of the story, nothing felt malicious. Nothing even felt wrong enough to name. If you had asked me then whether I felt disrespected, I would have said no. If you'd asked whether I felt fully seen, I might have hesitated, but I wouldn't have blamed anyone. I still believed effort naturally led to fairness. That consistency earned protection. That silence, when paired with competence, was interpreted as strength. I didn't yet understand how silence can also be interpreted as consent. The first moment didn't feel important when it happened. That's what makes it dangerous in hindsight. It was a project review meeting, mid-week, mid-quarter, the kind that blends into all the others if nothing goes wrong. I had spent 2 weeks coordinating between 3 departments, aligning timelines that didn't naturally want to coexist. I'd caught an early inconsistency in the data and rerouted the plan before it could become visible. By the time we sat down in that glass-walled room, the project was stable. Yeah. My boss opened the meeting with confidence. Too much confidence, I realize now. They walked leadership through the plan, my plan, using language I recognized because I'd written it. Not word for word, but close enough that I could trace every turn of phrase back to a document in my folder. I didn't expect a shout-out. I never did. But as the discussion moved on, something subtle happened. A question came up about risk mitigation. Before I could answer, my boss paused, frowned slightly, and said, "We had some early confusion there, but we worked through it." The room nodded. The conversation moved on. It was a small thing, almost nothing. But I felt it, like a thin paper cut across the back of my attention. Not painful, just noted. After the meeting, my boss stopped by my desk, smiled. "Good job holding things together," they said quietly. "That part could have gone sideways." I thanked them. I meant it. But the contrast lingered. Public, we had confusion. Private, you fixed it. No harm done, I told myself. This is just how they communicate. Maybe they didn't want to single me out. Maybe leadership doesn't need the details. That's how rationalization begins. Not as denial, but as generosity. The second cut came a week later. An email thread escalated unexpectedly. A stakeholder raised concerns about scope creep, concerns I'd flagged earlier and addressed in writing. My documentation was clear. The timeline adjustments were approved. Still, the tone of the reply from my boss surprised me. They wrote, "We may have underestimated the complexity here. Daniel is reviewing the implications. Not we're reviewing. Not this was already accounted for. Just me, positioned gently, but distinctly as the variable. No one challenged it. No one replied at all. The thread resolved itself in that quiet, corporate way where meaning is implied rather than stated. Again, nothing overt. Nothing warranted confrontation. But I saved the email. Not because I was angry, because something in me wanted to remember it exactly as it was. The third cut was the smallest of all, and the one I think about most. In a one-on-one, my boss said, almost casually, "You know, sometimes your strength is also your weakness." I asked what they meant. "You don't always advocate for yourself," they said. "It can make it hard for others to see your impact." It sounded like advice, supportive, even kind. But there was an inversion there I couldn't unsee. My impact was visible when it served them. My silence was a problem, only when it benefited me. Still, I nodded. I took it in. I told myself this was feedback, not framing. Around me, nothing changed. People joked in the kitchen. Calendars filled. Projects moved forward. No alarms, no whispers, but I started to feel a faint internal friction, like walking with a shoe that doesn't quite fit. Not enough to stop, just enough to make every step slightly more conscious. What stayed with me wasn't the events themselves. It was how easily they passed through the system without resistance. How naturally they were absorbed into the narrative of the workplace. No one meant harm, no one noticed. That was the point. I didn't feel wronged. I felt placed. And once you realize you've been placed somewhere without your consent, you start paying closer attention to the architecture around you. I began to replay conversations, to notice patterns in language, to distinguish between support that created safety and support that created dependence. The cuts were small, individually forgettable, but they were all in the same direction, and I was the only one keeping count. Once something happens more than once, it stops feeling like an exception. That's how it began to settle into my days, not as a problem, but as a texture. A background frequency I adjusted to without realizing I was doing it. The pattern was never dramatic. It didn't announce itself. It repeated quietly, in meetings, emails, and tone shifts. A suggestion I made would be acknowledged, then reintroduced later by someone else, usually my boss, with slightly different phrasing and noticeably more traction. A decision I was responsible for would be described as a group call when it succeeded, and a process gap when it didn't. Each instance came with a reasonable explanation: timing, context, leadership optics, communication style. I supplied those explanations myself. I told myself I was being mature, strategic, that reacting to every slight was a sign of insecurity. My job was to deliver, not to narrate my own contributions. And in truth, I believed that, at least partially. There was also the fear of misinterpretation. The quiet anxiety was that if I spoke up, I'd sound defensive. Or worse, petty. No one wants to be the person who insists on credit. No one wants to be labeled difficult, especially when the disrespect is ambiguous enough to be deniable. So I stayed quiet. I adjusted my expectations downward and my output upward. I overcommunicated in writing. I clarified assumptions before anyone asked. I made myself indispensable in ways that were invisible to people who didn't want to see. At first, this felt like control, like professionalism, but something else was happening under the surface. By normalizing the pattern, I was training the environment. I was signaling what I would tolerate. And systems, especially human ones, learn quickly. My boss began looping me into decisions earlier, but acknowledged me later. I became the person who handled things, but never the person who led them. When issues arose, I was consulted privately and cited publicly, selectively. The smile never left their face. In one-on-ones, the support continued. I appreciate you. I know I can rely on you. You're a stabilizing force. Those words matter. They disarm. They make you question your own discomfort. If I was so valued, why did I feel increasingly? I started noticing how others interacted with me. Not unkindly, but cautiously. Like I belonged to a certain tier. Not junior, not senior. Useful, but not upwardly mobile. The kind of person you assign tasks to, not authority. No one said it out loud. It didn't need to be said. And still I stayed. Part of it was loyalty. I had invested time, energy, and reputation. Walking away felt premature, drastic, like admitting defeat in a battle no one else believed was happening. Another part was hope. The belief that consistency would eventually correct the imbalance, that someone would notice. That fairness, left undisturbed, naturally emerges. That belief is powerful. It keeps you quiet when speaking might change the outcome. There were moments when I almost said something. When the meeting ended, I stayed behind, considering whether to follow my boss out and clarify a misrepresentation. Each time, I stopped myself. It's not worth it. They didn't mean it that way. This isn't the hill to die on. I told myself I was choosing peace. What I was really choosing was postponement, and the cost of postponement is cumulative. By the time the disrespect felt undeniable, it also felt entrenched. Like a role I'd been rehearsing for so long that stepping out of it would require explanation, justification, conflict. I had become predictably reasonable, predictably accommodating, predictably silent. The most unsettling realization came one evening as I packed up my bag after another late day. I paused, hand on the zipper, and thought, if I disappeared tomorrow, they'd miss my output, but not my absence. That wasn't self-pity, it was clarity. I wasn't being erased. I was being utilized exactly as intended, and I had helped make that possible by telling myself a story about patience, professionalism, and maturity that no longer matched the reality I was living in. By then, the pattern didn't feel like something happening to me. It felt like something I was participating in. That's when I knew, without panic, without anger, that something had to change. Not externally, internally. Roles don't require permission. They form when expectations go unchallenged long enough to harden into identity. I didn't wake up one day and realize I'd been assigned one. It arrived gradually, through repetition and reinforcement, until it felt less like a role and more like a natural law. I was the reliable one, not the visionary, not the decision-maker, not the person whose absence created disruption at the leadership level. I was the one who smoothed transitions, absorbed uncertainty, and ensured continuity. The system functioned better with me in it, but it never revolved around me. Once I saw that, I couldn't unsee it. In meetings, I was invited when execution was discussed, not direction. When priorities were set, I was informed, not consulted. When something needed to be handled carefully, it came to me, usually without authority, but with full responsibility. The language around me was telling. Daniel will take care of it. Daniel can help with that. Let's loop Daniel in. Always in, never up. My boss didn't block my growth overtly. There were no raised voices, no explicit denials. They supported me just enough to keep me functional, not enough to make me visible. Opportunities were framed as developmental but structured in ways that increased my workload without increasing my leverage. And I accepted them, because saying no would have disrupted the image I'd helped create. The most revealing moment came during a performance calibration discussion I was invited to observe, not as a participant, but as context. I listened as leadership discussed other managers' trajectories, high potential, stretch roles, strategic exposure. When my name came up, it was brief. Daniel's solid, someone said. Very dependable, another added. He's great where he is, my boss concluded. No disagreement, no follow-up. It wasn't said cruelly, it was said definitively. Where he is, that phrase landed differently than all the small cuts before it. It wasn't a miscommunication, it wasn't a tone issue, it was a placement. I realized then that my role wasn't temporary in their minds, it was structural. I was there to make other people's risks survivable. And because I never asked for more, no one felt compelled to offer it. This wasn't villainy, it was efficiency. Organizations don't promote people who make things easier by staying the same. They promote people who make themselves hard to ignore. I had done the opposite. The hardest part of this realization wasn't anger, it was accountability. I saw how my values had been quietly repurposed. How my preference for harmony had been interpreted as a lack of ambition. How my restraint had been mistaken for contentment. No one forced that interpretation. I allowed it. And once a system decides who you are, it begins protecting that version of you. Any deviation feels like friction. Any attempt to renegotiate feels unnecessary from their side. That's when I understood something uncomfortable. If I wanted to be seen differently, I couldn't ask to be. I would have to be different, without explanation. But before that could happen, something else needed to shift. Not my behavior, my orientation. I stopped thinking of my role as a reflection of my worth and started seeing it as a position others had an interest in keeping me in. And positions, unlike identities, can be exited, quietly, deliberately, on your own terms. I didn't announce anything. I didn't confront anyone. Outwardly, nothing changed. I still delivered, I still listened, I still smiled when appropriate. But internally, I stopped auditioning for approval. That was the beginning. The day something shifted didn't look important from the outside. There was no argument, no email that crossed a line, no meeting where I was openly undermined. If you had watched me that day, you would have seen the same version of me everyone else saw. Calm, focused, productive. But internally, a switch flipped. Not loudly, permanently. It happened during a routine one-on-one. My boss sat across from me, coffee in hand, posture relaxed. We talked through deliverables, timelines, and risks. The usual. Then they leaned back and said, almost conversationally, I'm going to need you to take ownership of the rollout issues from last week. I paused, not outwardly, but internally, because I knew that issue. I had flagged the risk, documented it, proposed an alternative. The decision to proceed anyway hadn't been mine. Still, I nodded, out of habit. Then my boss added, leadership is a little concerned. Nothing major. I just want you to be ready to explain what happened if it comes up. Explain. No, we'll explain. No, I'll support you. You. In that moment, something became painfully clear, not emotionally, but logically. Support in private. Exposure in public. I had felt it before, but this time I didn't rationalize it away. I didn't soften it. I didn't translate it into something more palatable. I simply observed it. And for the first time, I asked myself a different question. Not why are they doing this, but why am I still agreeing to carry it? I said evenly, I can explain my part of it. My boss smiled. Of course. The conversation moved on. But inside, the narrative I'd been living under dissolved. I realized I had been treating this situation like a misunderstanding that required patience, when in reality, it was a pattern that required boundaries. And boundaries don't emerge from explanation. They emerge from behavior. Later that day, I sat at my desk longer than usual after everyone left. The office lights dimmed automatically, one section at a time. I didn't feel angry. I felt awake. I opened my notebook, the one I'd been using inconsistently, without intention, and started writing differently. Not venting, not journaling, recording, dates, decisions. Who said what? What was documented? What wasn't? Patterns of accountability transfer. Language shifts between private and public settings. No commentary, just facts. As I wrote, I noticed how much evidence already existed, not of malice, but of asymmetry, of how often responsibility flowed in one direction and recognition in another. And then something else happened. I stopped needing them to change. That need, the hope that fairness would eventually assert itself, had been keeping me emotionally invested in an outcome I didn't control. Letting go of it was strangely relieving. I didn't plan revenge. I didn't fantasize about confrontation. I didn't even think about leaving, yet. I simply decided this. I would no longer protect a system that wouldn't protect me. That didn't mean sabotage. It didn't mean withdrawal. It meant precision. I would do exactly what was asked. No more, no less. I would clarify ownership explicitly. I would confirm decisions in writing. I would stop absorbing ambiguity as a favor. And most importantly, I would stop signaling that my silence meant acceptance. That day ended like any other. I shut down my computer. I walked out. I went home. I ate dinner. I slept. But something fundamental had changed. I wasn't waiting anymore. I wasn't hoping. I wasn't confused. I had crossed an internal line, from endurance to intention. And once that line is crossed, there's no going back to being unaware. The shift wasn't visible, but it was irreversible. After that day, my silence changed texture. Before, it had been reactive. A default setting shaped by habit, caution, and the hope that things would resolve themselves. Now it was deliberate, measured, chosen, and no one noticed the difference. That was the first confirmation that I was right about how I was perceived. I still spoke in meetings, I still answered questions, I still delivered on time, but I stopped filling gaps that weren't mine to fill. I stopped volunteering explanations that preemptively protected others. I stopped translating vague instructions into clean outcomes without written confirmation. When something was ambiguous, I asked for clarity, briefly, in writing. When a decision was made verbally, I summarized it in a follow-up email. When ownership was implied, I made it explicit. None of this was confrontational. It was professional, calm, almost invisible. But it subtly changed the flow of responsibility. People began to assume I was still absorbing everything the way I used to. They spoke loosely around me. They continued to frame things in meetings with broad language, trusting that I'd smooth the edges later. I didn't. Not out of spite, out of alignment. If a risk hadn't been assigned to me, I didn't quietly mitigate it. If a decision wasn't documented, I didn't act on it as if it were. If someone tried to retroactively shift accountability, I responded with timelines and records, politely, unemotionally. The silence that followed those responses was telling. My boss didn't react immediately. They still smiled, still praised me privately, still said things like, I appreciate how steady you are. But there was a faint hesitation now, a recalibration. I could sense when they were choosing their words more carefully around me, when they were less certain that I would carry something without acknowledgement. They mistook that change for distance, for disengagement, for weakness. That misinterpretation worked in my favor. There's a particular kind of arrogance that emerges when people believe you're passive. They become less guarded, less precise. They say things they assume won't be remembered. I remembered everything. I didn't argue. I didn't correct in the moment. I didn't signal that anything was wrong. I simply let patterns complete themselves. And in doing so, I learned how much of the system depended on my quiet interventions to function smoothly. How often I had been the invisible buffer between leadership decisions and operational reality. Without that buffer, small frictions began to surface. Nothing catastrophic, just enough to be noticed. A timeline slipped. Not dramatically, but enough to raise a question. A stakeholder asked for clarification that used to come preemptively. A risk surfaced that had always existed, but now lacked a quiet solution. No one blamed me. They didn't think to. They assumed I was still handling things the way I always had. That assumption created space. In that space, I observed, I watched how quickly narratives formed in the absence of clarity. How leadership filled gaps with convenience. How responsibility gravitated toward the person least likely to push back. And I watched how often that person was no longer me. My boss began looping others into conversations I used to be central to, not intentionally excluding me, just adapting, delegating. That's all good, That too worked in my favor, because the less I was centered in the visible flow of information, the more freedom I had to see the system as a whole. I wasn't withdrawing, I was repositioning, and the irony was this. The more intentional my silence became, the more people assumed I had nothing to say. They didn't realize that silence, when chosen, is often the loudest signal of all. It tells you who feels safe, who overreaches, who assumes immunity, and who never checks whether the ground beneath them is still as stable as it used to be. By the end of that phase, I wasn't frustrated. I was curious, and curiosity, when paired with patience, is a powerful form of leverage. What they never noticed was how much I was paying attention, not in the obvious way. I wasn't watching people for tells or waiting for mistakes. I wasn't trying to outmaneuver anyone in real time. What I was doing was quieter, slower, and far more durable. I was mapping the system. Once I stopped cushioning every friction point, the organization revealed itself more clearly. Processes showed their seams, decisions left trails, gaps appeared, not as failures, but as patterns that had always existed, quietly bridged by people like me. I began to document everything with intention, not just emails and meeting notes, but context. Who made which decisions? What assumptions were stated out loud? Which risks were acknowledged, dismissed, or deferred? I separated what was formally owned from what was emotionally outsourced. My notebook became chronological, clean, boring even. Dates, names, direct quotes when possible, attachments referenced, not editorialized. I didn't do this out of fear, I did it out of respect for reality, because reality, when recorded accurately, doesn't need interpretation. At the same time, I started learning parts of the business that had never been part of my role before. Not aggressively, not visibly, I asked neutral questions in cross-functional meetings. I read internal docs others skimmed. I paid attention to dependencies, legal, financial, operational, that most people only noticed when something broke. I learned who actually approved things versus who presented them, who carried informal authority, who avoided documentation, who relied on plausible deniability as a working style. None of this required confrontation. It required patience. I noticed how often my boss framed decisions as collective when they succeeded, and contextual when they didn't. How they spoke differently depending on who was in the room. How their confidence rested less on clarity and more on momentum. Momentum only works when no one slows down long enough to examine direction. I also noticed something else. People trusted me, not because I was powerful, but because I was consistent. Stakeholders spoke freely around me. They forwarded emails assuming I was looped in for support, not scrutiny. They shared concerns casually, expecting me to handle it the way I always had. I didn't betray that trust. I honored it by remembering. Slowly, I built a mental map of influence that didn't match the org chart. I saw which projects existed to justify decisions already made, which timelines were performative, which metrics were selectively emphasized, and I saw where my boss's confidence actually came from. It wasn't competence, it was insulation. They were buffered, by me, by others like me, from the consequences of incomplete thinking. Protected by people who preferred resolution over recognition. Once I stopped providing that insulation automatically, the system didn't collapse. It adjusted, but not in their favor. I also started positioning myself externally, not to leave immediately, but to understand my options. I updated my resume quietly, reconnected with old contacts, took conversations that were exploratory, not opportunistic. No ultimatums, no deadlines, just information. There's a calm that comes from knowing you're not trapped, even if you don't plan to move. And that calm changed how I showed up. I stopped seeking validation. I stopped reacting to tone. I stopped explaining myself beyond what was necessary. People sensed it, but misread it. They thought I was tired, or disengaged, or coasting. They didn't see the alignment forming beneath the surface. They didn't see how prepared I was becoming. Preparation, done quietly, doesn't look like ambition. It looks like compliance, like stillness, like nothing at all. Which is why it works. By the end of this phase, I wasn't angry at my boss. I wasn't even disappointed. I understood them. I understood the role they were playing, and the one they assumed I would always play in response. That assumption was the only leverage I needed, because the moment someone believes you will never move, they stop protecting themselves against the possibility that you might. And when that happens, they start leaving doors open. I didn't rush toward any of them. I just made sure I knew where they were. The reveal didn't arrive as a shock. It arrived as a confirmation. By the time I saw it clearly, I had already been circling it for weeks, maybe months, without naming it. Patterns tend to announce themselves quietly before they become undeniable. This one did the same. It surfaced during a routine cross-functional sync, the kind that usually passes without consequence. Legal was present, finance was present, product, operations, leadership, a wide table, too many voices, too little time. The conversation moved quickly. Assumptions stacked on top of assumptions. Decisions were referenced as if they were settled, even when no one could point to where they'd been settled. And then someone asked a simple question. Do we have formal approval on that change? The room went still, not dramatically, but noticeably. Eyes shifted. Someone cleared their throat. My boss spoke first. That was aligned earlier, they said. We're good. Aligned, not approved, not documented. Aligned. Legal didn't challenge it. Finance nodded tentatively. The meeting moved on. But something in me paused, because I knew that change. I knew exactly when it had been discussed. I knew who had been in the room. I knew what had not happened afterward. There was no approval. There was no written sign-off. There was no protection. After the meeting, I didn't react. I didn't follow up. I didn't ask questions. I went back to my desk and opened my records. Everything was there. The proposal, the risk notes, the unanswered follow-up email, the decision that was implied but never finalized. And I realized something that shifted the weight of the entire situation. The system wasn't just relying on my silence. It was relying on my absence from the record. My boss had been comfortable making decisions in spaces where accountability was diffuse and documentation was optional, because people like me had always filled the gaps later, cleaned up, formalized, made it safe. But now, those gaps remained. And in those gaps lived exposure. Not catastrophic exposure, not illegal, not scandalous. Just enough. Enough that if things went wrong, the narrative would need to be very carefully managed. Enough that responsibility couldn't be cleanly transferred without contradiction. Enough that someone would eventually ask, who approved this? And this time, there would be an answer. The private reveal wasn't powerful in the dramatic sense. It wasn't a smoking gun or a secret weapon. It was clarity. Clarity about where responsibility actually lived. About who benefited from ambiguity. About how easily risk had been externalized downward under the assumption that someone else would absorb it. And for the first time, I understood that I wasn't just protecting myself by documenting. I was holding a mirror. That knowledge didn't make me excited. It made me calm. Because leverage, when understood correctly, isn't something you wield. It's something you choose whether or not to release. I didn't tell anyone what I'd realized. Not a colleague, not a mentor, not even myself, out loud. I simply adjusted how I moved. I became more precise in meetings, more careful with language. When decisions were implied, I asked, once, for confirmation. If it didn't come, I noted it and moved on. I stopped closing loops that weren't mine to close, and slowly, I could feel the environment tightening, not around me, but around the assumptions people had been making. My boss grew slightly more cautious, not worried, just attentive. They asked more questions, checked in more frequently, tried to re-establish alignment through familiarity. I responded professionally, warmly, neutrally. No hints, no threats, no signals. Because leverage loses value the moment it's announced. What I felt wasn't triumph. It was a responsibility. Because once you see the true shape of a situation, you're accountable for how you respond to it. You can't unsee it. You can't pretend you're still confused. You can only choose. And that choice, I knew, would define what came next. Not just for my career, but for the kind of person I was willing to be under pressure. I didn't rush the decision, but I knew it was coming. Once you see leverage clearly, the hardest part isn't finding it. It's deciding what kind of person you're going to be now that you have it. For a while, I lived at that intersection. Between awareness and action, I didn't stall. I didn't rush. I let the options surface naturally, without forcing them into something dramatic. There were several paths open to me. I could confront my boss directly, lay everything out, ask for clarity, protection, and recognition. It would have felt honest. It might even have worked, temporarily. but it would have required them to admit something they didn't believe they were doing. And more importantly, it would have positioned me as someone asking for fairness from a system that benefited from my restraint. That path led to negotiation, and negotiation requires trust. Another option was escalation, involving HR leadership, presenting documentation, creating a formal record. That path led to containment. Issues like this rarely resolve cleanly at that level. They get reframed as communication gaps, style differences, mutual misunderstandings. The outcome would likely have been a compromise that preserved the hierarchy and redistributed discomfort just enough to quiet it. That path required emotional labor. A third option was departure, clean exit, new role, fresh start. It was tempting. It would have validated my instincts without requiring me to test them. But it also would have left the story unfinished, not emotionally, strategically. I would have carried the lesson, but not the agency. Leaving immediately would have protected me. It wouldn't have resolved anything. Then there was the option I didn't name at first, because it felt too subtle to count as a decision. I could stop compensating. Not withdraw, not sabotage, not expose. Just stop. Stop absorbing risk that wasn't mine. Stop filling gaps created by others' ambiguity. Stop lending credibility to decisions I didn't own. And in doing so, allow the system to encounter itself without my mediation. That option didn't require permission. It didn't require confrontation. And once fully committed to, it couldn't be reversed without me consciously stepping back into the role I'd already outgrown. That was the irreversible part. I wouldn't be able to unsee the dynamics or return to quiet endurance afterward. The moment I chose to stop protecting the structure would have to adapt or reveal its limits. I sat with that. I asked myself what my moral code actually demanded. Not what would make me feel vindicated, but what would let me walk away without regret. I didn't want anyone humiliated. I didn't want to weaponize information. I didn't want to become reactive. I wanted alignment, and alignment meant acting in a way that matched my values and acknowledged reality. So I chose the quietest option. I decided I would do my job exactly as defined. I would document, clarify, and execute, but I would no longer correct upstream decisions in silence. I would no longer accept responsibility without authority. I would no longer let my competence be used as insulation. That choice didn't feel dramatic. It felt clean. The moment I made it, something settled in me. The low-grade tension I'd been carrying, without realizing how constant it was, eased. I wasn't plotting. I was releasing myself from a role that no longer belonged to me. I didn't tell my boss. I didn't announce a change. I didn't change my tone or demeanor. But from that point on, every action I took was anchored in that decision. No more favors disguised as expectations. No more silence mistaken for consent. The system would now receive exactly what it asked for, nothing less, nothing extra. And if that exposed weaknesses, they wouldn't be mine. I didn't know how long it would take for the consequences to surface. I only knew that when they did, there would be no going back. Because choosing alignment over accommodation is a one-way door. Once you walk through it, the room behind you stops mattering. After the decision, nothing happened. At least nothing visible. That's the part most people misunderstand about quiet shifts. They don't announce themselves with immediate consequences. There's no dramatic feedback loop, no instant validation, just a steady alignment between what you do and what you no longer agree to compensate for. I moved carefully, but not cautiously. Every action I took was technically correct, professionally unremarkable. If someone audited my work, they would have found nothing to criticize, only a conspicuous absence of the extra effort that used to make everything look seamless. I clarified the scope before starting tasks. I asked who owned final approval. I documented dependencies instead of resolving them silently. None of this raised alarms. Why would it? From the outside, it looked like maturity, like process improvement, like someone becoming more strategic. My boss even commented on it once. "You seem more focused lately," they said. "More contained." I smiled. Just trying to be precise. They nodded. Approval without curiosity. That was the pattern now, affirmation without inspection. Behind the scenes, however, something subtle was unfolding. Decisions began to move more slowly, not because I delayed them, but because no one was quietly accelerating them anymore. Emails that once resolved themselves through unspoken understanding now require follow-ups. Meetings ended with more action items and fewer assumptions. The system wasn't breaking. It was revealing its true speed. I also began setting boundaries that looked like neutrality. When asked to just handle something outside my scope, I replied with, "Happy to support. Who's accountable for final sign-off?" When ownership wasn't clear, I waited, not passively, deliberately. People don't like waiting when they're used to things moving without friction. But impatience has a way of pointing toward the real problem, and it wasn't me. I noticed how often urgency was used as a substitute for clarity. How often my past responsiveness had masked indecision above me. Now, that indecision had to sit in the open. My boss started stepping in more frequently, not aggressively, just enough to maintain momentum. They made more calls, took more meetings, answered more questions directly. From the outside, it probably looked like leadership. From where I stood, it looked like exposure. Every decision made without documentation, every assumption spoken aloud, every alignment implied instead of confirmed, it all became part of the visible record. I wasn't collecting evidence. I was letting it exist. There's a difference. Meanwhile, I continued preparing quietly. I finalized my resume. I had conversations with 2 companies, nothing urgent, nothing dramatic. I learned my market value, not to inflate my ego, but to ground my choices. Knowing you can leave changes how you stay, not in arrogance, in calm. At work, I stopped volunteering emotional reassurance. I didn't soften feedback. I didn't interpret ambiguity kindly. I stayed factual. Neutrality unsettles people who rely on emotional labor to smooth over structural issues. Without that buffer, conversations became sharper, shorter, more revealing. Still, no one confronted me. Why would they? From their perspective, I was still doing everything right, still dependable, still quiet. They didn't yet understand that the version of me they relied on was no longer present. They assumed the system was intact. They didn't realize that one of its key supports had stepped aside. Not loudly, not angrily, but completely. I wasn't pushing. I was allowing gravity to do what it always does when something stops holding weight. It was never meant to carry, and gravity doesn't announce itself. It just works. At this stage, the consequences hadn't arrived, but they were already in motion. The first consequences didn't come with blame. They came with confusion. The meeting ran long because no one had the final numbers. A stakeholder asked why a dependency hadn't been flagged sooner. A timeline slipped. Not dramatically, just enough to make leadership uncomfortable. These were small things. Individually excusable, collectively unfamiliar. People started using phrases like, "This feels messier than usual," or "Did something change in the process?" No one said my name. No one connected the dots. Why would they? From their perspective, nothing about me had changed. I was still present, still responsive, still professional. What they were feeling was the absence of something they'd never consciously acknowledged before. Invisible stabilization, the quiet corrections, the anticipatory fixes. The uncredited work made decisions look smarter than they were. Without that layer, reality had more texture. My boss noticed it before anyone else. Not immediately, but before it became undeniable. They started checking in more often, asking questions that used to be rhetorical, wanting reassurance that things were covered. I gave accurate answers, not soothing ones. Yes, that's a risk. No, that hasn't been finalized yet. That decision would need sign-off. Each response was reasonable. Each one is slightly unsettling. Because it forced them to confront uncertainty they were used to outsourcing. I could see the recalibration happening in real time. They began attending meetings they used to skip, looping in legal earlier, asking finance to confirm assumptions. From the outside, it might have looked like increased diligence. From the inside, it felt like pressure. Pressure that used to dissipate quietly, now staying where it belonged. Others felt it too. A colleague pulled me aside one afternoon and asked, "Hey, did you used to handle this part? I thought you did." "I handled my part," I said. It wasn't defensive, it wasn't pointed. It was true. They nodded, slightly puzzled, and walked away. That happened more than once. People weren't upset with me. They were disoriented. The system they understood, where certain things just worked, no longer behaved the way it used to. And because the change wasn't dramatic, they couldn't locate it. That's the strange thing about invisible labor. When it stops, the loss is felt everywhere, but traced nowhere. My boss grew more careful in meetings, less declarative, more hedged. They started saying we'll follow up more often than we've decided. That shift mattered, because leadership is as much about perceived certainty as actual direction. When that certainty wavered, others hesitated too. Momentum slowed, not enough to trigger alarms, enough to register. At one point, my boss asked me, privately, if everything was okay. I met their eyes and said, yes, and it was. That was the truth they weren't prepared for. They weren't dealing with disengagement or resentment. They were dealing with alignment. And alignment doesn't announce itself emotionally. It just stops overextending. The consequences continued to accumulate. A presentation landed flat because assumptions weren't fully baked. A partner pushed back on a clause that should have been flagged earlier. Leadership asked for more documentation, more clarity. All reasonable requests, all things I had been providing quietly for years. Now they were being requested explicitly, and explicit requests come with accountability. I watched all of this without satisfaction or guilt, because nothing here was punitive. No one was being punished. They were simply experiencing the system without my quiet interventions. That distinction mattered to me. I hadn't created the strain. I had just stopped absorbing it, and slowly, almost imperceptibly, the narrative began to shift. Not to blame, toward exposure. By the time concern turned into urgency, the window for simple fixes had already closed. The shift wasn't sudden, it was cumulative. A series of small delays, unresolved questions, and decisions that no longer benefited from quiet correction began to stack up. Individually manageable, collectively destabilizing. Leadership started asking sharper questions, not accusatory ones, curious ones. Why wasn't this flagged earlier? Who approved this? What changed in the process? Those questions had always existed. The difference now was that they didn't dissolve into comfortable answers. My boss began reaching out more frequently. Short messages, calendar pings, quick check-ins that carried an edge they didn't have before. Can we sync? Just want to align. Need your perspective. I gave it, accurately. No editorializing, no smoothing, no translation. And I could feel the growing discomfort in the gaps between words. They tried to restore the old rhythm, suggested we get back to how things used to run, asked if I could help stabilize things again. Again, that word mattered. It implied that the current instability was a deviation, a temporary lapse that could be corrected by returning to familiar patterns. But those patterns required something I was no longer offering: unbounded accommodation. I didn't say no. I said, I'm happy to support. What specifically would you like me to own? That question hung heavier than any refusal, because ownership required clarity. And clarity required admitting where decisions had actually been made. That admission never came. Instead, there was a subtle shift in tone, less warmth, more formality, more distance. Not hostility, just recalibration. They began looping in HR, not for escalation, for alignment. They asked for more documentation, more process, more structure. The irony wasn't lost on me. The structure they were now seeking had always existed. It had just been quietly maintained by people like me, without recognition or authority. Now that maintenance was visible, and therefore uncomfortable. At one point, my boss asked me something that surprised me. Why didn't you say something earlier? I didn't answer right away, not because I didn't have an answer, but because the question itself revealed the misunderstanding. They assumed this was about communication. It wasn't. It was about consent, I said calmly. I did, in writing. And when decisions were made, I followed them. That was the end of the conversation. There was nothing to argue with. What they were experiencing wasn't rebellion. It wasn't defiance. It was the natural consequence of decisions finally being allowed to rest where they were made. And by now, it was too late to quietly reverse that. Because leadership had noticed. They had begun asking for clearer accountability chains. They wanted documented approvals. They wanted fewer assumptions and more signatures. That kind of scrutiny doesn't disappear once it starts. My boss tried to reassert control through proximity. More meetings, more involvement. But control without clarity only increases exposure. The trust they had relied on, the trust that things would just work, had eroded. Not because I broke it, because it had never been formalized. The most telling moment came when my boss, visibly stressed, said, "We need to present a unified front." Unified, as if the front had ever been anything but constructed. I nodded. Of course. But internally, I knew something they didn't. Unity built on unspoken labor can't survive scrutiny. And scrutiny had arrived. There were no villains here. No raised voices, no ultimatums. Just a system encountering its own limits. And once that happens, there's no resetting it to an earlier, more comfortable version. Because awareness, once introduced, doesn't leave quietly. It stays, asking questions, demanding answers. And by the time those questions are loud enough to cause panic, the conditions that created them are already irreversible. The confrontation, when it finally happened, didn't feel like a climax. It felt like a formality. My boss scheduled this meeting with a neutral subject line. Alignment check-in. In. No HR. No leadership. Just the two of us, in the same room where so many quiet assurances had been given before. They arrived early, I arrived on time. The energy was different, not tense, just stripped of pretense. No small talk, no casual smiles. They started carefully. I feel like something shifted, they said, and I'm trying to understand it. I nodded. Okay. A pause. You used to be more proactive, they continued. Things felt smoother. Lately, it feels like issues are surfacing later than they should. I let the silence sit long enough to be real. Then I said, I'm still proactive. I'm just being precise about ownership. That was it. No accusation, no defense. Just a statement of fact. They leaned back, processing. But you see the bigger picture, they said. You always have. That's why I relied on you. Relied. Not supported, not empowered. Relied. I still see it, I said. I just don't correct it silently anymore. Their expression changed. Not dramatically, but noticeably. Something between surprise and realization. So this is intentional, they said. Yes. Another pause. They tried a different angle. If there was an issue, you could have come to me. I met their eyes. I did. Multiple times, and decisions were made. They didn't argue that. Instead, they asked the question that mattered most to them. What do you want? I considered it, not theatrically, but honestly. I want alignment, I said. Between responsibility and authority, between private expectations and public support. They nodded slowly. That's reasonable. It was the first time they'd said that without qualifying it. But reasonableness, I'd learned, doesn't guarantee change. The conversation stayed calm, professional, almost clinical. There were no raised voices, no emotional appeals, just two people acknowledging a mismatch that had existed for a long time. They offered adjustments, clearer check-ins, more visibility, shared ownership language, all things that would have mattered months ago. I listened. I didn't interrupt. Then I said, I appreciate that, but I've already adjusted how I work. I'm comfortable with it. That was the quiet line. Not no, not yes. Just this is how it is now. They looked at me for a long moment, then nodded. I wish I'd understood this sooner, they said. I believed them. But understanding late doesn't undo structure. We ended the meeting politely, cordially, almost gently. There was no victory in it for me. No satisfaction. Just closure, because confrontation doesn't need heat to be final. Sometimes the calmest conversations are the ones that make it clear there's no returning to what was. And when I walked out of that room, I didn't feel lighter. I felt finished. I didn't leave immediately. That surprises people when I tell them this. They expect a clean break after a moment like that. A resignation letter, a dramatic pivot, a clear before and after line. But real change rarely moves that way. It settles first. It integrates. I stayed long enough to understand who I had become without the weight of that role pressing against me. And who I was then felt quieter. Not in the way I'd been quiet before. Contained, careful, adaptive, but in a grounded way. Like someone who no longer needed to manage perception. I did my work. I did it well. But I didn't contort myself to make it impressive. I didn't rush to fill silences or preempt discomfort. I let meetings end unresolved when resolution wasn't actually possible yet. That alone changed how people interacted with me. Some leaned in, asked better questions, clarified expectations. Others pulled back, became more formal, more cautious. Both reactions told me the same thing. I was no longer predictable. And predictability, I realized, had been the real currency I'd been trading all along. Without it, I felt less useful, but more whole. I stopped defining myself by how indispensable I was. I stopped measuring my value by how much I could carry without complaint. I let go of the quiet pride I'd once taken in being the one who could always be relied on, no matter the cost. That pride had kept me small. Now my sense of identity came from something else. Coherence. My words matched my actions. My responsibilities matched my authority. My silence matched my intent. There was no bitterness in that, just clarity. I began having conversations, internally and externally, that felt different. Not aspirational, not performative, honest. When recruiters asked what I was looking for, I didn't list titles or compensation first. I talked about decision-making, about accountability, about cultures where support didn't disappear in public. Some conversations ended quickly, others didn't. Either way, I didn't take it personally. I was no longer trying to fit into systems that required me to disappear in order to function. Eventually, when I did choose to move on, it didn't feel like escape. It felt like alignment completing itself. I left without resentment. I gave notice. I transitioned cleanly. I documented thoroughly. Even then, I didn't rush. Because I had learned something essential. Urgency is often a sign you're still reacting. I wasn't. I carried the experience with me. Not as a wound, but as a calibration. A deeper understanding of how quiet dynamics shape outcomes. Of how power often hides behind politeness. Of how silence, when unexamined, can slowly rewrite who you are. Now, when I enter new spaces, I listen, but I also mark boundaries early. I clarify ownership. I pay attention to how support shows up when others are watching, not with suspicion, with discernment. I'm still calm, still measured, still quiet in my way, but I'm no longer invisible to myself, and that has made all the difference. When I look back on this story now, what stays with me isn't the imbalance, or even the quiet betrayal of being supported in private and exposed in silence. What stays with me is how easy it was to mistake endurance for virtue. For a long time, I believed that staying calm meant staying aligned, that being patient meant being principled, that if I just kept my head down and did good work, the system would eventually recognize it and respond in kind. That belief wasn't naive. It was ours incomplete, because systems don't correct themselves out of fairness. They correct themselves when incentives change, when patterns stop being rewarded with free labor, emotional buffering, or quiet compliance. No one in this story woke up intending to exploit me. My boss didn't see themselves as manipulative. My colleagues didn't think they were benefiting from my silence. The environment simply adapted to what I consistently provided. And for a long time, I provided too much without definition. The real turning point wasn't when I gained leverage. It was when I stopped using my character as collateral. When I realized that integrity doesn't mean absorbing harm quietly, it means refusing to participate in dynamics that require your diminishment to function. I didn't win by exposing anyone. I didn't win by outmaneuvering the system. I didn't win by being louder, harsher, or more aggressive. I won by becoming precise, by aligning my actions with my values instead of my fears, by letting responsibility rest where it belonged, by understanding that silence is only strength when it's chosen, not when it's expected. If there's a moral here, it's not trust no one or play the game better. It's this: if you are consistently calm, competent, and quiet, people may mistake you for someone who will always absorb imbalance. And the moment you realize that, you are responsible, not for fixing the system, but for deciding whether you will continue to carry it. You don't owe anyone your invisibility. You don't owe anyone your silence. And you don't need revenge to reclaim yourself. Sometimes, the most powerful thing you can do is stop compensating and let reality speak in your place. I tell this story not to warn, but to reflect. Because many of us have been the quiet ones, the reliable one, the person who made things work while others took credit for the outcome. And many of us don't realize how much we've been carrying until we set it down. So I'll end with this, not as a challenge, but as an invitation to reflect. Have you ever noticed a moment in your life where staying quiet felt virtuous, but slowly cost you more than you realized? If that question resonates, I'd be curious to hear your story.